I have the really great honor of getting to introduce and have a conversation with our guest here today, who is the director of the Gracie Project, whose name is Gracie. Gracie was born in the Lawrence of Missouri, Columbia, Missouri, and she is an independent producer and director and writer working in both narrative and nonfiction film. I would say if you go to her website, gracelee.net, you can see all of her films, which very early student films starring Sandra Oh, very cool. And she also, what we watched today for this is their 2005 documentary, The Gracie Project, which won multiple awards and was broadcast on the Sundance Channel. Was called Ridiculously Entertaining by New York Magazine, and a funny but complex meditation on identity and cultural expectation by Variety. In 2013, she directed the Peabody Award-winning documentary American Revolutionary: The Evolution of Gracie Boggs, one of the women who is in the Gracie Project. The film premiered at the Los Angeles Film Festival, where it won its first of 6 audience awards before its broadcast on the PBS documentary series POV. Grace is a producer and director on the 5-part landmark PBS series The Asian Americans, as well as And She Could Be Next, about women of color transforming politics and civic engagement. I watched all of the trailers of all of these just before this as I was preparing. Like, what an accomplished director that we're here tonight with, and just really thankful that you're here, Grace, and that we can spend some time talking. And then as Kathleen said, if people have questions, put that in the chat and we'll monitor it, and I'm happy to ask some of those, or people can raise their hands kind of as we get to the end of the questions I have. So welcome. How are you, Grace?
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me. It's nice to be in the Midwest, I guess, with you guys again. And yeah, I'm doing well. I'm as Brad mentioned, this film is several years old, but it's always interesting to hear how it resonates in the present day. It was my first feature-length documentary, and I've made several since then, but it still kind of defines, it's called the Gracie Project. It has kind of defined me for many years. But so thanks for having me.
We did kind of want to start off, our questions with that Midwest connection, and that is definitely, part of the beginning of the documentary and how you frame it. What brought your family to Columbia? What did your parents do? Do you ever go back to visit?
My dad taught at the University of Missouri. He got a job teaching there. They're both Korean immigrants. They came in the early 60s. My dad went to grad school in Iowa, and my mom was a resident in Chicago. They met. They didn't want to go back to Korea at the time. And my dad got a job teaching physics at the University of Missouri, and that's how we ended up there.
Are there still connections back in Columbia?
No, my parents actually left Columbia like in the 90s. They moved back to Korea, and now they've made a lot of different stops. But I think the main connection for me is it definitely, I was born and raised there. I went all through, elementary through high school. I went to the University of Missouri. So I have a lot of ties to Columbia, but no like family connections. I think probably the most relevant connection is the True False Documentary Film Festival that now is in Columbia, where, it was interesting at a certain point. I think the Gracie Project played there in 2006 or 2005. I can't remember what year. And I remember the programmers telling me we had to program the very first lines of the film. I was born and raised in Columbia, Missouri. So it definitely profoundly shaped who I am and my Asian American identity. It's a very different experience than growing up in, say, a Chinatown or a Koreatown in LA, where I actually live now. So yeah, I'm happy to talk about that too.
Great. No, I could imagine. I lived in LA for about 4 years, and yeah, just the radical difference of being in the Midwest and in Los Angeles is just, yeah, I mean, it's they're very different places in the makeup of the people that live there, certainly. And just so
Although,
many more people, so many more people. I
yeah,
don't
but
know
at
if you
the
had that
same time,
experience. So many
at this,
people.
that everyone is from somewhere. There's so many transplants in Los Angeles, and it also is a very sprawling, like feels kind of suburban like city. It's not like high rises, well, in certain parts. So, it feels there's a lot of people from all over the world, all over the country in Los Angeles. So, yeah, I meet people from the Midwest all the time and elsewhere. So,
Yeah. No, my wife has always said that when we moved there, it felt like if you took New York and threw it really hard on the ground and it just splattered, that's kind of what Los Angeles feels like. It's just doesn't have that kind of density. Well, how did you get started in deciding to be a filmmaker and working in documentary work in particular?
well, I didn't grow up thinking I would be a filmmaker. I thought I would be a journalist. I was really involved in like high school journalism, and that's why I started going to the University of Missouri because of their journalism school. But kind of halfway through, I realized, oh, I had an internship at a big newspaper, and I realized like the daily journalism grind wasn't for me. I was more interested in like how kind of long form storytelling, like taking more time to research and look at questions and topics that interested me. I ended up switching my major to history, and so that kind of has given me like this more broader background that has helped me in my documentary work. And I wasn't always, I'm just interested in the storytelling period, not necessarily just documentaries, although I love documentaries. When I went to film school, I only did like fiction, writing scripts and working with actors. So I'm just really interested in things that interest me, and then like what is the form it would take. And so with the Grace Lee project, for example, for many years I had this idea because once I left the Midwest, I knew nobody named Grace growing up, and there were definitely very few Asian Americans in my schools and everything. So as I say in the film, when I started like going to New York or Los Angeles and meeting all these people who had grown up with Grace Lees, like I was like, oh, that would be funny to make a film about like all these Grace Lees. But I didn't feel like, I felt very self-indulgent, like who cares, only me. But when I started film school at UCLA, graduate film school, there was a time where I noticed there were like 12 other Grace Lees at UCLA, and I kept getting some of their emails. And that's when I just thought like, oh, well, this is not just like this phenomenon that has been happening anecdotally, it's happening to me right now. And, the more I would talk about it with friends, they would say, oh, well, that's really interesting. Like that, I could relate to that, like, I have the name, like Alberto Gonzalez or something, like that's the Grace Lee of my community or something like that. And so it just became more about like identity and like what's in a name, and like, how does that shape you? And for me, being in a place where, where I came from, living in a place with not many Asians, to being completely surrounded by Koreans when I lived in Korea, and then in a place like places like New York and Los Angeles, I realized like oftentimes the way people talked about Grace Lee, the stereotypical Grace Lee that they never remembered, is the way that people often talked about Asian Americans, kind of the overachieving, accomplished, but whatever happened to her, I have no idea. Right. So I thought that was an interesting question to explore in the Grace Lee project, like looking at identity in a way that was also, there's kind of painful things about it, but there's also like absurdly funny things about it. And that's what I was interested in exploring.
That's what I really love about the film, is that, that it takes something, and Interior Chinatown is actually quite similar. It takes something, very philosophical and something very much about like race in the United States, right, and our history, but then it also has this sense of humor too. Like as you were talking, it was making me think like, did the idea, like at what point did you find that kind of thread about what the name Grace Lee means? Did you discover that as you were making the film, or did that, because is the premise kind of you would do something and that you would meet all these Grace Lees, or was that assumption already kind of there in your brain?
No, I think it built up over time because, as I said, I had no Grace really meant nothing to me. I thought it was a really unique name growing up because nobody had it. It was a very, like, to me, it was like a very old fashioned, like, white lady name, like growing up. I didn't associate with Asians at all until I started meeting a lot of other Asian Americans who would tell me about like the other Grace Lee they once knew. And so I think it took many years of like hearing these anecdotes of people's other Grace Lees that I realized, like, what is happening here? There's something that I need to investigate. It's kind of a weird thing to investigate, but it felt very personal and also kind of universal, and thinking about Asian American identity, female identity. So, while I was in film school, I had this thing where there were 12 other Grace Lees attending UCLA, right? And then I think another thing happened, which is Grace Lee Boggs, who I eventually made another film about 10 years later. She came to the campus, and I kind of knew who she was. She had just written her autobiography. And when I met her at like some event that she had in the Asian American Studies department, I immediately knew, like, oh my God, this person, she has to be in the film. I went up, I introduced myself to her, and that sort of started the thread of another film. But I knew she needed to be in the Grace Lee project. Eventually, when I went to Detroit and spent a lot of time with her, like immediately, it was like, oh, this is way beyond just the common name thing. It delves into like American history. It delves into, Detroit history. It delves into like social movements, all of these things. And I didn't know how to make that film, but I just knew I was really interested in this other Midwestern Grace Lee. So Grace Lee.
Right. No, I was so thrilled to see that there was that you had made that film specifically about Grace Lee Boggs. Our history is so vast, and that's somebody that I didn't know about, and like what an incredible person so she came to UCLA, and then that just, it kind of, that was serendipitous, and then to some extent, and then helped kind of build something new organically from there.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of like what my interest in filmmaking just sort of stems from, like, I just become interested in something, like a question, like, why are these people named Grace Lee? Like, what does that mean? Then meeting somebody like Grace Lee Boggs, it's like, how did I never hear about you? I was a history major. I studied like civil rights movement. I did all these things, but how could I have not learned about you? I mean, you're writing your autobiography now, and that the impetus for that film was just like, okay, like, let's tell this story because this is a hidden story. This is an American history story that we've never heard about either, even though she's written her own autobiography. What can I bring to it? Like if you, it's actually going to be, you can find it on all the platforms, but I think it's going to be streaming free on PBS starting in May again, or sometime soon. I think they're re-upping it. But that film was really just really sort of, it's called American Revolutionary, the Evolution of Grace Lee Boggs. And there's a reason it's not called Asian American Revolutionary. Her life really is about like 70 years of social movements in the United States. So.
No, it's powerful. It's amazing. I look forward to seeing that film. It's just, just the way that I think you explore multiple different things through that name, through the film is what is just really great to see how it moves from your premise to then concentrating on these people and the experiences of kind of, and certain people where they're, where the reason that they got their name, like the religious kind of naming and the importance of Christianity in certain Korean and Korean American communities, and how that has an influence on that person's life, or how the Grace Kelly component, and just these, it's all of these ways that people became Grace Lees it's just a really great exploration of that. I love that. One question that I had here in my prepared questions, and somebody did ask in the chat, is, are you in touch with any of we're 15 or so more years down the road. How many of the Grace Lees are you in touch with these days?
Well, I mean, Gracie Boggs passed away in 2015. I'm still in touch with the 14-year-old who's now like married. um, and actually, there's the Grace Lee, the adopted Grace Lee, who's deaf.
Yeah.
Still in touch with her and her son. Her son is an editor. He went from making the Star Wars videos, on his home computer, and now he's like a film editor in LA. Who else? Those are the main ones I'm in touch with. I mean, I'm sure I'm Facebook friends with the rest of them, but I don't talk to them on a daily basis.
Yeah.
The one I was most in touch with was Gracie Boggs, obviously, since I was making another film about her.
That's what he did a pretty good Darth Vader, I have to say, for being put on the spot, having to do that.
Right.
I was pretty impressed. I think he was short selling himself on his Darth Vader. But yeah, wow, that's lovely to hear. We've talked about this somewhat, but maybe a little bit more specifically, what message do you hope that people take away from the Grace Lee project?
I mean, I'm always interested in knowing what people take away from the Grace Lee project. So, you know, I don't know. I mean, like,
It might be a
I'd
good
love to hear-
audience question.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think for me, all of my work, I'm really interested in like expanding our ideas of, who we are like as humans, right? And if it expands like your idea of what is an Asian American or Asian American identity, I think then it's succeeded. Like, I don't think that's a huge bar, but I felt like, like has anyone seen Everything Everywhere All at Once? It's an awesome movie. Just the multiverse of like Grace Lee's, or who we can be, like I sort of set out to like disprove a stereotype, but actually like there's so much complexity in who we are. And hopefully like that's all I want to do in the end, is just like make sure, people understand that we're all humans, complex, and can learn something from each other. So
I love that. The thing that I love about this film, that I love about Interior Chinatown, is just they were like most of my schooling is in African American studies, and so I think we have such a literally black and white understanding of race in the United States sometimes. Even as an American studies major, we cover like Native Americans, Asian American, European Americans, we cover those things, but very quickly I think that they can tend to be forgotten. Like to me, Interior Chinatown, with literally this cop show being a black cop and a white cop and then the generic Asian man, and it was a good like gut check for me to just like, I think your films get to that really well, and just kind of this way in which we can, that the way that we think about race is sometimes really misrepresented in this country. And so I love the way that you're shining light on that and really pulling, all of the diversity of who we are as Americans together with this. They're just, I'm glad to see more space being made for that. I feel like you're having a really strong impact, especially with some of the newer films that you've been working on as well.
yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we see things in such a black and white way, and having grown up in this born and raised in this country, in the heartland of America, but having, I think, my own interest in like telling stories, and interested in history, and like interest in stories like Grace Lee Boggs, is all about like my parents are Korean immigrants. Like I didn't learn anything about Korea like at all growing up, and very little in like history classes or anything. And I knew that their stories were so like rich and complex, probably like this Interior Chinatown, which I haven't read yet. And like where are those stories? Like I think that who gets to have complex, like three-dimensional stories in literature and television and movies, and I think that a lot of my work has been trying to kind of like correct that for myself, and also just like make the stuff that I would like to see, even you know, I said earlier, like I can't make a film about people named Grace Lees. That's way too, and that sounds very self-indulgent, right? But actually the absurdity of like being one of the many Grace Lees is something that I think many people can relate to. I think that's why the film was so hit a nerve when it came out, not just for Asian Americans, but anybody who's ever struggled with like identity and sort of being pigeonholed in a certain way, I think can relate to the film. And so I think that, it's a very common phrase, like the more specific you can get, like you can understand like how universal your story actually is. So.
Right. Well, I did want to turn a bit to oh yeah, so many Brad Allens in the world. Like Rock Rock Hudson, it's Brad Allen, as I'm told. I haven't seen Pillow Talk, but whatever. Yeah, I love that. Just that idea between, and I think you deal with it really well in the film, between like this universal sense that we all have as being a human being, but that we're all individuals, yet we all also share this commonality, both at the same time, right? They don't lay in contradiction with one another. They lay together as different ways of being, right? I'm curious, just because now I just seeing the things that you've been up to recently. I'm curious to hear more about this very important PBS series, The Asian Americans, and this newest documentary, your wallpaper, And She Could Be Next. I'm excited to see both of those. Would you care to talk about how those got made
Sure. So Asian Americans, it came out in 2020. It's a historic, it's a PBS series about the history of Asian American history through the lens of personal stories of Asians over 150 years. And that's something that I think had been in the works for many years. I was just a producer director on two of the episodes, two of the 5 episodes, but it was a very collaborative team. I did the episode that sort of dealing with World War II, and then also the 60s episode kind of looking at birth of consciousness, like the birth of, the term Asian American only came about in like 1968, and looking at, sort of solidarity across different movements, like the farm workers movement, which was, everybody knows about Cesar Chavez, but actually that movement was started by Filipino workers, along with Mexicans, in Delano, California. Also looking at Vietnam. I mean, we only have an hour, but looking at Vietnam through a very different lens, which is through Asian Americans who went to, fight in the war for the United States, but were often seen as the enemy because of, they can't hide their race on their face. And also Vietnamese Americans, including the novelist Viet Thanh Nguyen, and Ham Tran is someone I went to film school with, like this generation, my generation of, Asian Americans sort of retelling like that conflict from their perspective, right? So that was a really great project to work on. It was very well received, and, like so many people don't know anything about Asian American history. So it's a great kind of primer for anyone who wants to know more about it. And it's not boring, I promise. It's very compelling because it sort of looks at like family stories and generational stories and sort of bigger issues, like what has shaped like the Asian experience in the Americas, which includes like colonialism and race and all exclusion, all kinds of things like that. So, oh, and then And She Could Be Next is a project that I a 2-part documentary that also came out in 2020, looking at sort of changing demographics in this country and looking at women of color as kind of transformative people in politics and as candidates and as organizers. So we shot it in 2018, and we sort of looked at like many different at many different levels of politicians running for office, elective office. And then we spent a lot of time in Georgia, sort of looking at like the Stacey Abrams campaign for governor and looking at kind of the voter suppression issues and how like kind of, this new American majority, which is largely, people of color, like what impact that's having on our political landscape. So
That's great. Another question just came in on the chat that's a good follow-up to these is what are you working on currently?
I'm actually taking a bit of I'm not in production on anything right now. I'm just sort of researching and developing new projects. I spent most of last year working on a podcast actually called Viewers Like Us, which stemmed from an essay I wrote in 2020 about kind of systemic inequities in public television. I basically asked the question, why is PBS so white? Right. And I did it in a way sort of I'm always interested in these questions, like, why are there so many Grace Lees? Like, why is PBS so white? PBS is an institution that I have really gotten a lot of opportunities from, but, its founding mission back 51 or 52 years ago was to truly reflect the American public. And, me and a lot of other people are asking the question, is that actually happening, right? With the mission to reflect the diversity of America. So I wrote an essay. I asked why Ken Burns is sort of like considered America's storyteller, and then eventually made a podcast that sort of explores a lot of questions connected to that. So
Chris has asked a question about where funding from, some of the projects like the PBS projects, PBS funded, through some of those productions, something like the Grace Lee project or this podcast, where does funding come from on some of your other projects? As a documentarian, you have to seek that funding. Where places where you've sought that?
Yeah,
or received it?
It depends on the project. The Grace Lee project, I made it totally independently. I got grants to make it for the most part, and I did it very cheaply. I was just out of film school. Other projects like Asian Americans, PBS only, it was through the PBS station in Washington, D.C., but also, the executive producers had to raise a lot of money elsewhere from like Ford Foundation or, different foundations. A lot of my work, I've gotten money from funds from, different foundations, but also like independent investments, equity. But mostly, the independent work is grant funded for the most part. And then there's like work for hire, which is somebody else is just paying for that. So.
There was a question about where the podcast is available to listen to. Is that on just most of the main podcast services?
You can find it on wherever you listen to your podcast, but there's also a website. I'll put it right here. Hold on. Viewerslikeus.com. Yeah. Oh, somebody asked me a direct question. Should I answer it here? From Sharon. How atypical did you find yourself? Did you choose to have children? Choose not to go with your parents back to Korea? I have a child. I did go back to Korea, but I was an adult. I don't think I'm that. It's interesting. Like you watch the Grace Lee project, I'm not those Grace Lees. I'm not the overachieving, like, why am I the loser in comparison that didn't go to Harvard and, at age 15, et cetera. But what was funny when I was making the film, I was in film school when I had the idea, and I was telling my friends, I was like, yeah, and there's all these Grace Lees who they did this and they did this and all that, and they're really accomplished, and that's just not fair, and then my friends would look at me and just like, what are you talking about? That's exactly how I see you, and so it was just always like this funny, I don't think I'm that way, but okay, maybe I am in a way a kind of model minority, but I'm modeling in a different way, I guess. And I guess for me, I just want to leave room for again, like complexity and like divergence. Like I'm definitely not a tiger mom, like at all. Terrible. Like I should be more of one. I'm a failed tiger mom. But maybe that's okay. So.
Thank you.
Do any other folks have any, any questions that you would just like to come off of mute and ask? You're welcome to do that. I've kind of come to the end of my list of prepared questions.
Yeah, you're welcome to raise your hand or just unmute. I guess one question I had is in regards to Gracie Boggs. I mean, what did meeting her teach you kind of about the intergenerational differences between the Gracies? I mean, she seemed to have a different perspective, and I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, Gracie Boggs just kind of breaks the mold for everybody.
Yeah, really and truly.
I was looking for like the criminal Gracie, but I was like, okay, I already met Gracie Boggs. Like my search is over because I get to meet this person, and ultimately, like it sparked another film, and as I've often said, like I had no idea like what that film was going to be. I just needed an excuse to like be around this person and like just sort of learn. I remember when she came to LA, and me and my friends from film school, always like, we're just following her around, right? And she like went to some talk where she like debated Marxism with this guy, and then she could just turn around and like, she could do it all, and it was so exciting to like be in the presence of someone whose like ideas were just like, her mind was whirring all the time. And I just wanted to be around that. And at the same time, like over time, after having made that film for so many years, being able to actually experience, if you watch the film, it talks a lot about evolution and revolution. And so, to experience evolution, like actually watching this woman age and also, sort of understand like how her ideas have been shaped over time and how they've, benefited from like dialectical thinking and like, reflection and all of this stuff was profoundly influential for me. I still, if you know who she is, or if you've read her books, or if you've watched the film, like there's so many sayings that she had that I keep hearing every day, like especially when we live in such like complicated times, such difficult times. And I think about her a lot. So yeah, I'm happy for myself that I just decided to like go with it, not knowing what would happen, but just sort of like making the decision and like saying, I need to make something about this person. This person needs to be like part of my education, sort of moving forward. And it definitely shaped like my willingness to like, tested my perseverance. It tested like, I didn't know how to make it. It's a complex film, but it almost felt like another graduate degree, like making that documentary. So yeah, and I learned a lot about myself. I also, it took like 10 years, not full time, but it took 10 years to actually finish that film. So I got to try out a lot of different things.
Yeah. Well, I know you interviewed a lot of just different Gracies. Was there a Gracie that you did not include that you wish you had, as in your research?
Well, yeah, if you remember from the film, there was the girl who tried to burn down the school.
Oh, right. Yeah, exactly.
So I was trying to find her for a long time. And I think when you see in the film, this is before Google, I started this film, so people just had to find the website and like fill out this survey and, sort of listed kind of details about themselves. And I remember sort of kind of triangulating like who this Gracie could be. And I had a hunch that this person had actually come through my website and, filled out my survey. And I think I was right. And one day I just emailed her saying, are you that one? And she called me.
The arsonist.
Yeah, but she didn't want to talk about it because she had moved on, that was a long time ago. She had like gone on to like something very like law school or something like that. And, she just wanted me to know that like she saw me, but she didn't want to talk about it. So it would have been interesting to like talk to her again, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought it was sad that it was because of the shame she felt for her grades. And
Yeah.
I know that's, I mean, that's common with a lot of, especially girls that age, it seems to be. And that's too bad that she felt that way and wanted to burn down the school as a result. That's that's complicated, but yeah, I was just curious
They didn't
because
do a very good, they didn't do a very good job as
yeah, not at all. Well, does anybody else have oh, Chris, you have a question?
Yes, how well are you recognized back in Korea?
nobody knows who I am in Korea.
What a shame.
Nobody. Yeah, no. I mean, I lived in Korea like in the 90s, and then my parents, like nobody knows who I am. Yeah.
Gracie?
I think yeah, Jack has a question too, Kathleen.
Oh, sorry. Go for it, Gracie. And then we'll hit you, Jack.
Have you come full circle and embraced your name and realize your uniqueness still?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, I knew that kind of making the film, you know, like it was, yeah, I think I say it at the end of the film, like I enjoy meeting these other Grace Lees. Like there is this funny, what's still so interesting to me is that there's still like Grace Lees being named every year. Like there's still young people named Grace Lee. Like no one got the memo that like Grace is such a common name. But you know what's interesting? Actually, I've spoken to in classes. One of my friends teaches at UCLA Asian American Studies, and I came to her class and I was talking, and there was a Grace Lee in the class who's probably like 20. You know, this is like a couple of years ago, and she had a very different reaction for me when I made the Grace Lee project, which was she knew about the Grace Lee project, the film. And so she felt the pressure of like, you know, living up to like a filmmaker who made a film about Grace Lee. I was like, that's so weird, you know, because yeah, anyway, it was very funny to like experience that. So, and also I think the Grace Lee Boggs is a big, you know, influencer as well. But at least it's like this radical activist, you know, like broke the mold in so many ways. I always liked the name. I really did. Like I thought it was unique. There was just that little phase like in my early 20s, like what's happening? Like, why are all these people Grace Lee? So.
Grace or Jack, do you have a question?
Yeah, in all your projects that seeking advocacy of Asian American equality, recognition, whatever, and other people you've worked with who are doing the same, do Asian Americans view the advocacy of Asian American equality, or is there individually Japanese American, Korean American, Chinese American equality that they look at separately? I mean, obviously came here historically over different times, different issues, or is it just like Latin American equality,
Right.
where it's all countries? Is it more like that?
I recommend you watch episode 4 of the Asian Americans. Like history.
Okay, no, I would have watched the whole project.
Yeah.
I hadn't seen it, but
I think, you know, Asian American is a political term that came into existence in the 60s, right? They were like mostly Chinese and Japanese Americans who were like second or third generation. Their parents or grandparents were immigrants, and they were finding commonalities based on, you know, their experience growing up as Americans, but with, you know, from Asian descent. And so I think there's like a distinction. You know, for me, I say Asian American, I also say Korean American when I'm referring to the specifics of that.
Yeah.
But like to me, Asian American is an identity that, you know, I connect with other Asian Americans who are very different from me. You know, like I grew up in Colombia, but, you know, there's Asian Americans who grew up in New York City or Los Angeles, Koreatown. there's Southeast Asians, there's, South Asians. We have a very different like racialized experience in the United States. But there are some commonalities of being from, like this Asian American category. I think, I didn't get to study like Asian American studies. There was no major like that when I was in college. But on my own, eventually, like I really kind of gained a lot from that. So
there seems to be such a huge divergence of history,
yeah.
and even of those with earlier history, and now you have Indian or Pakistani or Vietnamese or Cambodian Americans who are more recent immigrants with different history with America and different experiences. And that's why I was kind of asking.
Yeah. No, it's a really complex, diverse community. And, like Asian American, some people take issue with Asian American because they feel like it sort of flattens everything out. And then, there's the specifics of like your immigration history, like whether you come from like post Southeast wars in Southeast Asia, or what generation you came, right? And so I think for me, I grew up pretty middle class, educated, like in the Midwest, speaking English. I'm a citizen, like Asian American is kind of the thing that I sort of gravitated toward, but I also recognize like there's so much, even my own parents moved back to Korea after 30 years in the United States, right? And so there's like a lot of back and forth happening. We live in a transnational world. And I think that also that complexity is what's really interesting about Asian America. It's not a monolith, right? Like so many communities aren't. So
Thank you.
Yeah,
Sharon.
sure. Yes.
I see your
I
hand raised
wondered
there.
whether you had almost set up Gracie Boggs against that young woman, very attractive, but she represented the completely committed Christian community. Were they seen as two different aspects? You seem almost enamored of the young woman. She had such certainty and such rectitude. I wonder whether you followed up with her.
are you talking about the pastor's kid or? Yeah, I don't know what happened to her. Like, I know she didn't get married at 23 or 25. But I don't really, we're probably Facebook friends, but I haven't stayed in touch with her. I was just interested in, because I didn't know this going into the project. I didn't realize, although it seems obvious now, like the heavy Christian influence, of the name Grace. And that there were so many pastors' kids who were named Grace Lee. So I wanted to include that for that reason. Same reason, like the Grace Kelly like thing. I had no idea that would come out as well, but it says so much about like, maybe our parents' generation or grandparents' generation enamored with like Hollywood, blonde, blue-eyed Grace Kelly.
Right.
So I just thought that says a lot about like femininity and, like ideals of like what we want our daughters to be, a movie star who became a princess. I mean, that's a huge order, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I just wondered because in San Francisco, the Korean church is really powerful. And with the knowledge you have of the African American community through Gracie Boggs, I wondered if the Korean church played an important part in terms of identity for many Koreans of your generation.
Yeah, I mean, definitely it has. Like even in Columbia, Missouri, where I grew up. Like in the early days, there was like a traveling Korean pastor who would come like once a month, probably going to Lawrence, Kansas and like all these other places. But I mean, I didn't know what they were saying. So like that was for my parents' generation. So, they often joke like Chinese like start a restaurant, like Japanese start a business and Koreans start a church. And there's like some truth to that, I think. The organization of the Korean church is really yeah, it's like it's a social organizing tool for so many people.
Right. And very important in terms of the history with the African American community and the conflicts that arose.
Well, we have a little bit more time for maybe another question or so. Does anybody else have a question for Grace? Oops, here comes somebody entering the waiting room. All right, well, why don't we wrap it up then? But thank you so much. I wanted to end this by saying Read Across Lawrence will continue tomorrow night, where Charles Yu, who's author of Interior Chinatown, will be in conversation with Derek Kwan from the Lead Center. So that is at 7 o'clock, and the link is on the library webpage if you're interested in attending. And then next week, we had to reschedule this event. So it is happening Thursday, April 28th. David Mai from KU's film department will present Generic Asian American Hollywood's Invisible Role. So he's a really interesting professor up at the university, and that event will happen at 6:30 in the auditorium. It's a live event on, again, Thursday, April 28th. So, and just looking ahead to May for this group for Dessert and a Movie. It'll happen on May 11th at 7 o'clock. We're watching the documentary on Canopy called A Genuine Forger, and it's about famous art forgeries. And I'm excited because our special guest is Jeff Weinberg, who lives here in Lawrence, a former KU administrator. And he is an art collector and has his own art forgery story. So I will just leave you with that and let you be intrigued, but it's a pretty fun, I think it'll be a pretty fun evening. So, but if everybody wants to unmute and give Grace Lee a round of applause, I think that's completely appropriate. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was fun.
Yeah, no, it was wonderful, and what a great movie. And I can't wait to look up the Grace Lee Boggs documentary. So Brad, do you want to take us out? The closing
Thank
remarks.
you so much for coming. I would say too, not only, Jeff is a great benefactor when it comes to Canopy itself.
It's true.
We get to see all of these films on Canopy because Jeff and Mary Weinberg pay for it in its entirety. I don't know if you all knew that. That's public information, right? It's on the website. So we're very thankful to Jeff and Mary for their sponsorship of being able to see amazing quality films through Canopy. And yeah, I might have to sneak in and hear him talk about art and forgery. So anyway, but no, I'm just so thankful to be here, and Grace, thank you so much. I just it was really, really nice to have this conversation, and I hope everybody